This is a document that I have created. Obviously, it's focused for political science, but the information here really applies to anyone. So I wanted to share this first off to show that there isn't such a thing as a pre-law major. From the graph here, it looks like political science is dominant and it is the most common major, but even political science majors only make up maybe 20% of people applying to law school. So there are all kinds of majors that you can have, and there's really no limitation. If you're interested in, chemistry or art history, you can major in those things and still go to law school. There's nothing stopping you. So don't let anybody convince you that there is a pre-law major or pre-law path. You should follow whatever you're most interested in because that's what you're going to be most engaged with. You're going to be most interested in working on the classwork, and you'll develop your skills the best if you care about the material. You'll notice that the top majors here, the ones that are the most successful law school applicants, are in majors that require a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of analysis. So in addition to political science, you often see English and history and philosophy especially are usually very common majors. But again, if you're interested, that's what matters the most. I'm also going to point out this. So this has a lot of other information on it. Like I said, I created this more for recruiting prospective students who are thinking about law school and political science. But it also has my contact information, so you can always contact me, whether, whatever your major is, whether or not you ever take a class with me. I'm happy to help. And I should introduce myself too. I'm Dr. Ross from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. I teach courses in constitutional law and judicial process here at FGCU. And I unofficially do some pre-law advising for whoever asks me. And so you're here, so that means you have an invitation, whether you ever take a class with me or not, or we ever interact outside of this. If you have questions and you decide to apply to law school, you can contact me when the time comes. But I wanted to share this timeline because people worry about, what should I be doing? When should I be doing these things? And the good news is if you're a freshman, sophomore, there's nothing really that you need to be doing specifically for law school other than what you'd be doing anyway. Taking classes, taking classes you're interested in and finding a major that you like, and doing activities around campus or the community that you feel passionate about. There's nothing specific that you need to do to prepare for law school. If you just follow your interests and your passions, that's going to make you the best possible person and also law school applicant. It's really in your junior year that you will want to start thinking a little bit more concretely about the steps of the application process, and particularly the Lsat. So if you're a junior, I always recommend that you should start preparing for the Lsat right about now, if you haven't already, because you do need to prepare. You need to know a little bit about the test. It's a weird test. It's different from anything else you've taken. It's not like the SAT or the ACT. So you need to prepare for it. You can start at any time, but you really want to start ramping up in the few months before you take the test. And my recommendation is always to start preparing about now, this time of year in your junior year, so that you can take the LSAT over the summer. And that's really that last category here, the summer before your senior year. I always recommend that students take the LSAT over the summer. The LSAT now is offered more often. It used to be only 4 times a year, so you really had to be careful when you scheduled it. Now it's offered 8 or 9 times, which is fantastic. So there's 2 different dates in the summer. You should plan to take it then, because even if you are going to take it a second time, you've gotten that first time under your belt. It's not going to be quite as nerve-wracking the second time, but it's so much better to take it over the summer because you're not going to be taking a lot of other classes. Even if you're doing a summer class, it's not going to be as overwhelming as if you're taking a full semester's worth of classes. And you can focus and really work on just the LSAT and get that score. And ideally, you get the score you want and you start your senior year not worried about it at all. You've already got your score. You're ready to get that application in right off the bat. And the applications open in September. for the most part. And there's a rolling application process. So you can apply as early as September, but you can apply at any point. The earlier, the better, though. The sooner that you apply, that shows that you are on top of things, that you are ready for this kind of challenge. And if you think about it, they have all of the seats and all of the scholarship money available at the beginning of the process. If you don't get your application in until the late spring, there's not as much there to left for you. So the sooner the better. That's why I always advise taking the Lsat over the summer. And then really the only hurdle for you is getting your letters of recommendation and writing a personal statement. And that's really hard. That's something I'll talk individually with students. Almost always, it's someone I'm writing a letter for. If I ask, do you need a little help with the personal statement? They always say yes, because it's really hard. So talk to faculty, talk to me if you'd like about that, but really the biggest hurdle is the LSAT. That is the number, probably 1, 2, 3, 4 of what prevents people from applying on time. So that is my advice for a timeline. I'm here to help anywhere along the way. The other thing I'll draw your attention to up here is that we have a lot of law schools in Florida, but I generally tell students that there are only 5 that I would really recommend applying to. There might be one more that I'd add to this list, maybe as a stretch, but there are 5 schools that are nationally ranked. And the ones that are not nationally ranked are not any cheaper than these. In fact, some of these are cheaper than the non-ranked schools. These are the schools that have the highest bar passage rate for their students. They have the best preparation for their students to actually get jobs after law school. And so I strongly recommend that these are the schools that you focus on. And we are lucky enough to be joined by a representative from the top law school in Florida, the University of Florida. And I'm going to stop talking now and turn things over to him so he can tell us all about what the University of Florida has to offer for law students. So let me introduce Mr. Brandon Sykes.
Hey everyone, thank you for having me. As Dr. Ross said, and thank you for that fantastic introduction. My name is Brandon Sykes. I'm the Assistant Director for Admissions here at the University of Florida Levin College of Law. It's great to be chatting with y'all today. So the way I would like for this to work is I would like for this to be somewhat conversational. So if y'all have questions as I'm going, please unmute yourself, ask them. I'll pause at various times to see if there are questions, but feel free to just stop me if I come to a quick stopping point to just ask whatever questions you have. Happy to answer them. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So for those that don't know, UF, we're in Gainesville, Florida. We'll start with the basics, right? So that is smack dab in central North Florida. We're about an hour and a half southwest of Jacksonville, about 2 hours directly north of Orlando, about an hour from each coast, right? So we're right there in the middle of North Florida, for those that don't know. Gainesville, it's a college town. It's very much a college town in the same breath as, your standard SEC Southern college towns. Obviously, we have a little bit more of a Florida feel. I'm from Georgia, so whether or not Florida is considered the South is up for debate among different folks. But Gainesville is very much a Southern town, but we obviously have a lot of people and influences from Central and South Florida as well. So we got a good mix up here in town. But it is a town where there's enough going on to keep you busy. But if you want the city life, you're definitely going to have to hop over to Jacksonville or down to Orlando for that. As someone, I didn't go to UF for law school, but I went to law school in a college town. I really appreciate the college town atmosphere for law school because like I said, there's enough going on to keep you busy. You're not going to have a ton of free time in law school, but you will have some. And so it's nice to have easy access to live music, social events, sports, what have you, restaurants. But at the same time, it's quiet enough, it's easy enough to get around to where there aren't a ton of distractions and it's easy to kind of put your head down and get your stuff done. So I'm a fan of college towns for law school. So in terms of our class profile, so for 2020, our incoming class profile, our median GPA in Lsat, it was a 384 and a 165. The average age was 24. So that's pretty standard for a lot of law schools. Some schools will tend to skew a little bit older than us. That does kind of skew a little young in terms of law schools. About half our students go straight through in our incoming class. And so by straight through, I'm talking you finish your senior year, you don't take any time off, you start your 1L year of law school. About half our students fall into that category. About 40% of our students tend to be 1 to 5 years out of undergrad. And then 8 to 10% will tend to be 5+ years out of undergrad when they start in their first year of law school. So it's kind of an age breakdown. For our class of 2020, so we're about 50% women, so about half and half there. 1/3 of our students identify as racially or ethnically diverse. And let's see, about 24% of our students come from out of state, outside the state of Florida. And about 23% of our students are first-generation college students. And last year, we provided scholarships to all first-generation college students of at least 25%. A number of those students receive scholarships in terms of like merit-based scholarships, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But for students that didn't receive any merit-based scholarships that were first-generation college students, we provided them with a 25% scholarship. And that's a practice that we are continuing for this cycle as well. Well, before I move on, any questions on anything?
Yes. Has the COVID situation caused a large shift to the online setting for your classes?
Yes and no, right? So the way we're a hybrid school. Like we have that hybrid model where I would say about 75% of our classes are still on campus to some extent. Every student that wanted to attend virtually was given the option to. All our classes are set up to be synchronous. So there will be like a virtual contingent in each class, even if there is like an online or an in-person aspect to that course. Some courses are only taught online. And usually in that situation, it's because the professor is only teaching online for whatever reason. So that's kind of how we've done it. We're using a lot of our bigger classrooms and obviously have smaller class sizes. So for all the social distancing, plexiglass, all of that. But more or less classes are still operating in person to some extent. Well, where we've seen the biggest difference is more with like the extra events that come with law school, right? Like there's always some type of speaker on campus. There's always some type of event some student organization is putting on. All of that is either gone completely virtual or it's just not happening. And so from a classroom perspective, it looks relatively similar to how it has in the past, but in terms of just the environment, it looks a lot different. If that makes sense.
Yes, that makes sense.
So one thing real quick before I kind of move on to like jobs, bar passage, tuition, like that sort of stuff. How many of y'all are familiar with 509 reports? See a hand, 2 hands. Awesome. Okay. Well, that's great. Because I'm about to blow your mind. So the number one place to get information on law schools is from the law schools themselves, whether that's their website, whether that's their admissions office, something like that, right? The second best place to get them, and I'll share my screen, are these things called 509 reports. And the reason I want to highlight them is because there's a lot of like third-party information, like law school numbers, law school data, Reddit, where the information is either, a lot of it is either outdated or just wrong. And so 509s are two places you can find them. One is on the front page of every law school. The ABA requires that schools put their 509 reports linked somewhere on their front page. And the reason being, these are data reports that the ABA puts together that is based on the information we give them in order to be accredited, right? And so with these, it is going to be all the information about LSATs, GPA medians, demographics of the student body, scholarship spend, how much those scholarships are, tuition fees, attrition, you can go back, employment numbers. So what type of jobs are they getting? Where are those jobs? Bar passage numbers, all of that can be found here. The other place, if you just Google ABA 509, you can come and you can pull the report of any school from one centralized location and get all that information right there. The other thing that you can do, and this is low-key a cheat code. So if you were interested in first-year class statistics, you can pull an Excel spreadsheet that lists all the schools in one spreadsheet with all their data, just like right here in the spreadsheet. Obviously, there's some formatting stuff that you're gonna have to go through and do on your own if you wanna get it to match up exactly how you want it to. But yeah, all that information is just right here for every law school. And so I would really recommend using those when you're trying to figure out like information on different law schools and like that sort of thing. So jobs, right? So jobs. So three things. So this is personal opinion. So take it with that. The three most important things I think a student should answer in the affirmative when they're picking a law school are, will this school get me the job that I want in the place that I want it? Is this school gonna help me pass the bar in the state that I want to practice? And can I leave this school with a debt load that is manageable, however you define manageable, right? Like that's gonna be a personal decision from person to person. I would recommend that before you move on to anything else about a law school, because there are a number of other factors that are important in making a law school choice. I would recommend starting with finding out if the school answers those three fundamental questions, in my opinion. And so I think for a lot of students, that answer is yes for UF. And so just in terms of jobs, over 97% of our class of 2019 were employed within 9 months of graduation or pursuing further graduate school education, whether that's like an MBA or LLM, like that sort of thing. And we have 21,000 alums, living alums, which is a pretty big number in terms of living law school alums. I went to, a University of Insert State school, so big law school, and we have 12,000 alums. So I'm one of 12,000. UF is 21,000. So that's a big number in terms of alums, and those are folks that can help you get jobs, right? They're folks that can help you network, and they're willing to do that. As an anecdotal story, real quick, we were doing an admissions event not last year because COVID, but 2 years ago. And we had an alum there, and the alum just came up to me and Chris, my colleague, and he asked us, hey, is there anyone in here that doesn't have a job yet. I need to hire somebody. And I was able to be like, that person right there doesn't have a job yet. And sure enough, they exchanged information, chatted later on, and that student got a job. You know, so we do really rely on our alums to land those jobs. And we have alums in all 50 states. Between North and South Dakota, we have 6. So even if you're interested in going to North and South Dakota, we can connect you with an alum out there that would be willing to help you. And so we have a career and professional development office on campus, and they're an office of attorneys who are, their job is to, 1, help students pick their courses, and 2, help them get their jobs. And the reason we set it up that way is because, you know, there's some synergy between the person who's helping you decide which courses are going to help you get those jobs. You know, that's going to be the same person that's helping you ultimately get the job as well, right? And so we feel like having that kind of streamlined process works well for us. In terms of bar passage, over the last 2 years, we've been 12 to 15 points ahead of the Florida average in terms of bar passage, which is something that, you know, we're proud of, and that is something that we've invested in over the last few years. And our bar passage is 90% outside the state of Florida. The reason it's higher outside the state than within the state is, y'all may or may not know this, the Florida bar is one of the harder state bars in the country, for a number of reasons that I am not sure if it's just myth or fact at this point, so I won't say them in this setting. And so, and also in terms of tuition, so I'm assuming most of y'all are in state, if not all of you. Be considered Florida residents. Cool. So yeah, in-state tuition is just south of $22,000 a year. Out-of-state tuition is about $38,000 a year. And, you know, I alluded to merit-based scholarships earlier. About 75% of our incoming class of 2020 received some amount of merit aid. And those scholarships range from 25% of tuition and fees to a full ride and a stipend. So in theory, we paid some students to go to law school. And so, and this will be a good point for me to kind of talk about our review process. I was going to talk about it a little bit later, but it probably makes more sense now. So for our review process, we take a holistic review on the admission side of things. So when we're making a decision of whether or not we should admit a student, we are taking into account the GPA and the Lsat, but we're also taking into account the personal statement, the extracurriculars, all those things that we call soft factors, right? We refer to hard factors as the numbers, the GPA, the Lsat. The soft factors are gonna be, again, like your personal statement, letters of recommendation, extracurriculars, work experience, all of that. All of those things go into our decision-making process in terms of, is this student going to be someone we want to admit or not, right? We definitely try to take into account the whole student. Who is the student that we are getting on this campus that's going to be a leader in our community, and a leader as an alum within the legal community, right? The scholarship side of things, that tends to be much more numbers focused. The scholarships are not entirely, but almost entirely based on GPA and Lsat. That, when it's not the case, there are a couple situations. There are certain students that may not have the numbers where we just as an admissions committee feel like we need to give this person a scholarship. Also, for example, the first generation scholarships that we gave out, those are obviously not numbers, and for another reason. But that tends to be how our scholarship spend is allocated. Any questions on anything before I move on?
Yeah, I got a question. So when you're, you said GPA and LSATs are important for scholarships. I assume it is, but are like course loads and majors taken into consideration too when looking at that?
Yes, yes. So generally speaking, in most situations, the focus is going to be on what that number is. However, we do use our best judgment in terms of like context around like course loads, majors. You know, so and I'll say this as someone who is not a math and science person, but like a chem major will look at a GPA for a chem major differently than maybe some other majors, right? In terms of like, and I say that as someone who has like nightmares about. I started out as pre-med, fun fact. When I went to law school, took a couple science classes, realized, you know what, law school is probably for me.
And actually,
yeah, we definitely recognize that when we're making our decision.
I want to just follow up on that quickly because it's quite common that I'll meet with a student who did start out thinking they'd be headed, you know, pre-med or nursing or some kind of hard science background, and then they take that first semester, first year of classes, and it doesn't go well, and they worry that that's going to haunt them when they get to the application process for law school. And I always try to talk about, you know, that's, you can in your personal statement make that part of your story. So so does that, how does that look from the other side of things?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily bode negatively or positively for a student, right? Like we just understand that that's like a situation that kind of just happens. Like as I mentioned, like I mean that's literally exactly what happened to me. For me, it was bio 111 that was the nail in my pre-med coffin. So there are a couple ways students can handle it, right? The personal statement is certainly one of them. They also can show it through like a GPA addenda. I wasn't necessarily going to get into like that much detail with like in terms of like the application process today, but one thing I will touch on is like we have a series of different like optional essays or addenda, and one of them is a GPA or LSAT addenda, and that is kind of your opportunity to bring context to anything that kind of stands out within your transcript or the LSATs that you've taken. So if you have an LSAT that is significantly lower than your other two, you know, it allows you to say like, hey, this is why it was lower. You know, something could have happened in your life. You could have gotten a flat tire on the way to the testing site in a time where, you know, we're testing in person and you traveled to the testing sites. You know, and similarly for the GPA addendum, you can kind of say like, hey, I started out as pre-med. As you can see, once I switched out of these chemistry and biology classes, look at what my GPA was for the remaining semester type of thing. And so like that, the GPA addendum is good because it draws attention to it, because we're not going to assume any context with a situation. We do look at the trends in grades from the transcript. However, those details are helpful, right? Because like, while I can look at a transcript and say, okay, they took science classes, they didn't do as well in their freshman and sophomore years, but since then they've done better. You know, I don't necessarily know the why behind that, right? Like I can see it and I can understand it, but to the extent that you can bring context to your personal situation to any of those situations, it's certainly helpful from our standpoint.
And so if you feel like that applies to any of you out there, that is, I would say, one of the most common first questions I get when the student sits down in my office is they're worried about their GPA, they had something, and you know, I usually like to try to calm those fears. So it's good to hear from the other side of the process that there is a way to give some context to that. And oftentimes in that conversation where we talk about what challenges you may have had, that often leads to, well, here's what your personal statement can be about. If you found a passion later on, your sophomore year, talk about that. And, that's, so it can end up being, if not that the GPA is a positive, you can frame it in a way that makes it part of your story.
That's exactly right. And the other thing too, I want to point out that I don't think a lot of people recognize, and I honestly didn't even know it until I started working in admissions 2 years ago when I took this role, is if you look at it at a class, right, like an incoming 1L class, and you see the median GPA and the median LSAT, how the class actually looks in terms of students, the vast majority of the class are going to be folks that are either above the LSAT and below the GPA, or above the GPA and below the LSAT. There will be some number of students that are above both, and there will be some number of students that are below both, but the bulk of the class is going to be above one or the other. And so so you can offset, for example, a lower GPA with a higher LSAT, a higher or a lower LSAT with a higher GPA. And then you also can be below both and still be admitted, as every law school in the country has seats in their class that are taken up by students who are below both their medians. And so like, I wouldn't necessarily look at a low GPA, particularly early on in the process, as any type of, like prohibitive type of factor in your decision-making process. Any other questions?
Yeah, it was just about this admission cycle, because I mean, every admission cycle is really competitive, but this one in particular has been like, I mean, extremely nerve-wracking. So do you think that next year will be the same, and why do you think this cycle is so competitive?
That's a fantastic question. It's one that we've been talking about this cycle, both the competitive nature of it, but just this cycle in general and how it's been its own kind of monster. I mean, we had a meeting about it a few hours ago. So I'm trying to, so it's tough to wonder. So like, there are a couple things. And keep in mind that a lot of these are going to be just my thoughts, right? And like things that like we in our office, to some extent, are guessing on. Because to be candid with you, we don't know much more than y'all do in terms of like why this cycle is the way it is. So one, just in general, usually in economic downturns, law school apps go up. And that part is pretty standard. Like you can look at, recessions over, time. And like, that is a pretty consistent trend. And the reason being is when people are either out of work or have hours reduced, they look at, if they've had law school in their mind, they look at it as like, well, now is as good a time as any to like kind of, transition and change my career and go into law school. Similarly, students are coming out of college and they're not getting as many jobs as they normally would in a bad economic time. So they're like, okay, well, I'll just go to law school. So that's part of it, right? But that doesn't account for nearly even close to like all. Usually that's good for like a 5% increase, maybe 10%. Nationwide, we're seeing 30% increases in application. Another part of it, we think, is because 2020 was just a year where, politics were at the forefront, social justice was at the forefront. A lot of these conversations were being had in a very public way. And so we think that a lot of people got inspired by that to pursue careers in law. That's part of it. We also wonder how much of it is just particularly early on in, shutdown times, people just had a lot of time on their hands. And so, people just found the time to study for the LSAT more than they normally would have. More people, your opportunity cost of like going through the time to apply for law school is lower because there wasn't a lot of that you could do with like the rest of your time. So more people may have just been like kind of sitting around and were like, you know what, like maybe I'll look into applying for law school in a way that they hadn't in the past. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, like, a lot of that is like, those are like kind of guesses that we have within our office and within admissions, but we're not entirely sure why it's the case. In terms of next year, so what I'm interested to see, trying to pick my words carefully. So because there's such an increase so there are a few things. So because there's such an increase in applications, what I'm waiting to see is how the law schools respond to it, right? So because like law school budgets are being thrown, and I don't want to take up too much time going too far into the weeds on this, but law school budgets are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So are schools going to enroll bigger classes? Are they just going to cut down on scholarships? Are they going to use this as an opportunity to raise some of their metrics for their incoming class? Like, we don't know. And so how that's going to affect. And so basically right now, there are more applicants than seats in last year's cycle. And so is that going to kick applicants to the next year? Like, we don't know. And so I'm not exactly sure how it's going to go next year. I could see it looking similar. I could see it clearing up a lot and looking more like a normal cycle. I just am not sure.
I just hope it goes back to normal.
Yeah.
I'll ask a quick related question. Has there been much difference since the LSAT has been online for these the last year with the LSAT Flex? Have you noticed much difference in the scores that you're seeing from students?
So early on in the cycle, the scores tended to be a little bit higher than what we had seen in the past. There were, LSAC mentioned that like a lot of the reason they thought was kind of what I had alluded to earlier, that people had more time to study. So they performed a little bit better on it early on. We've seen as time has gone on in the cycle that scores have started to kind of level off with past years a little bit more. But overall, within the applicant pool, scores seem to be up. It's hard to say, is that because of LSAT Flex? Is it because there are just more applicants? Is it a combination of both? I think once this cycle's over, and this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, is a lot of the deep dives that folks are going to do, like kind of on the data and the information and like how schools adjusted to this year, I think is going to be pretty interesting from the administrative nerd standpoint.
And we've talked about the cycle a bit. Could you give us a sense of when you get most of the applications? Is there like a rush period where everybody's sending in, or is it even throughout the cycle?
Yeah. So the advice you gave at the like very, very beginning about applying early was 100% correct. Especially for UF. But I mean, I would venture to say I'm sure it's correct generally too. We admit on a rolling basis. Our application goes live on September 1st, which means as soon as students start applying, we can start admitting. We usually don't start admitting until mid-October-ish. We let those apps kind of add up in the early standpoint. So whether you apply in September versus October isn't like a significant thing. But usually the sweet spot to apply to us is sometime between September and January 1st. We admit all the way through the cycle. We admit for example, our priority deadline is March 15th, which is kind of, it's not a hard deadline. Our actual hard deadline is July 15th. But the March 15th deadline is just kind of a signal that, hey, like after this date, the admission cycle is just kind of, it's not a regular admission cycle anymore.
You're late.
You know, and so,
No.
yeah, at that point is we are going to be admitting one-off students here and there type of thing. Usually around February-ish, right about now is when you start to see us start to slow down in terms of admissions. You start to see folks starting to get waitlisted or denied who may have been admitted had they applied in say November or December. And you know, the reason being is there's just less seats at that point. When we're admitting early on in the cycle, we have X number of seats to fill. By the time we get to February, there's only going to be a handful left. And so the big thing that ultimately ends up happening to students, when we're admitting in say February, or not February, but September, October, November, we are viewing the student almost in a vacuum, right? Like we are admitting the student that application is in front of us in a vacuum. Is this student admissible? Yes, no. Waitlist, yes, no. Denied, yes, no. Whereas once you start getting towards like February, we're admitting the student, but it is in the context of like this broader class that is like kind of been shaped over the course of the cycle, right? And so the decision is becoming less about the student. It's obviously still about the student, but it also becomes more about like, okay, how does our class look, right? So if we get to February and we realize 90% of our admitted student pool is from in-state, then it's going to be harder to get in at that point if you're an in-state student, right? Versus an out-of-state student, right? On the other side, if we see that 50% of our applicant pool is from out of state at that point, then it's going to be harder to get admitted at that point if you're out of state, because we want to get our in-state number back up. And then that's kind of like how it works, you know, in terms of like, do we need more STEM majors, right? STEM majors might have a better shot at getting in at that point, right? So it's just like thinking about it, the later you apply, the more you take it out of just your own hands on getting admitted, and you leave it like almost subject to the broader applicant pool, the broader admitted pool within our law school. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly what I tell students. So that sounds good.
Awesome. So real quick, a couple things that I'll just touch on, and then I'll leave a few minutes for more questions if you have them. So let's see. I will pull this up. So we have these things called curriculum roadmaps, and I love these. Here we go. I love these because, so basically what happened is our career and professional development office, academic affairs office. Can y'all see these? See
Yes.
my page? Let's see. So basically career professional development, academic affairs, they went through and we're like, all right, what are the topic areas that students that at UF are most interested in, right? And so these are the ones that students tend to be more interested in. We obviously have courses and areas that aren't listed here, but these just are the ones that we tend to get the most students interested in them. We tend to get the most questions about. And what they did, let's say, we'll go family law, right? So these are all the courses that we have in family law. Faculty members that you learn from here, the clinics that we have in the area. We have 8 total clinics, but here are 4 of them right here. Summer experiences, you can go to, say, environmental, right? Courses, faculty, summer experiences, externships, fellowships, study abroad, right? But basically all the offerings that we have in a given area can kind of be found within these roadmaps. We only have 2 required courses after your 1L year. So it really gives students the flexibility to kind of figure out the curriculum that matches what their end goals are. It also works really well for the student who doesn't know what they want to do, which is really common. That was me also when I went to law school, where you go into law school, having no idea what area of law you want to practice, right, or what you want to do. Having that kind of freedom with your curriculum is really helpful in that regard, because it really allows you to take classes in a bunch of different areas, just kind of get a sense of what you like and what you don't. And like I said, I was one of those students that went in having no idea what I wanted to do. Tried a bunch of different stuff. I ended up working in college athletics when I got out of law school, and so you can have a pretty wide range of experiences within law school to kind of figure it out. I worked at an immigration law firm. I worked in the public defender's office for 3 semesters. And I really liked both of those experiences. But I just kind of recognized that, they weren't for me long-term. And I ultimately ended up working in college athletics for a while. So that's something that's nice. But these curriculum roadmaps, if you just Google curriculum roadmap, Florida law, you can find them. If you go to our website, search on our website, you can find them there. They're also under the academics tab on our website. But you can kind of look through there and kind of get a sense of the different things that we have on campus for students with given areas. Like I mentioned, we have 8 clinics. Clinics are great for those that don't know what they are. You're basically able to work in your community locally for an attorney on real cases with real clients. So one, they're just great for getting that experience. Because you can learn a lot from sitting in a classroom, but you're not going to learn how to be an attorney until you actually get your hands dirty and work with clients and work on cases. So they're great for that. And they also give you class credit. You don't get paid for them, but you get credit for class from them. And then right before I'll open this up for questions after this, I just want to plug our semester in practice program real quick. So what that is, semester in practice program, it's in your 3L year, either your first semester or second semester 3L year. You're working with no on-campus courses in the metro area that you ultimately want to work when you graduate, right? So if you want to be in DC, you're working in DC. If you want to be in Miami, you're working in Miami. We had a student working in Honolulu 2 years ago, which wasn't bad. We had another student working in Buenos Aires. They already had their job, but the number one client for their firm that they're working for is a company that was based out of Buenos Aires. And so they were down there working for the client to build that relationship so that when they started at their firm, they already kind of had that relationship with that big client. But the semester in practice program is great because for students who want to stay in Florida for sure, but definitely the students who want to go out of state, because it allows you to get into that network. And so you're for an attorney or judge in DC, but you're meeting folks, you're shaking hands, you're doing those things. So that semester in practice program is something that, I definitely would have taken advantage of if I had access to it when I was in law school. But with that, I will open it up for any questions that y'all have.
I have a question regarding tuition, and then kind of combined with your advice on whether or not we should take a gap year between our bachelor's and law school. After doing some research, I found that comparing to, for example, UM and FIU, the price of living in Gainesville is a lot lower. And I feel like it's a lot more pleasant than, such a crowded city like Miami. So I wanted to know how, specifically with your experience, how that works into the tuition and the loans, and how we could estimate how much we would need and all that, because it's already a lot with tuition.
Sure. So there are a couple things. So every school, every law school, every school generally, that's regulated by the federal government, they have like a cost of attendance number that you can find. most schools will put it on their website, but there's probably a centralized place that you could also find it. Like those numbers are a good or a reasonable gauge. However, they may not be as reflective of the actual reality of, because like those numbers are based on some assumptions that may or may not be feasible living situations in certain places. I would look, just kind of get an idea of like how much housing costs in a given town. There are some cost of a living adjusters that are kind of out there. Like if you just Google comparing cost of living between like this town versus this city type of thing. I'm not exactly sure how accurate those are, but like, for example, like that's what I used when I was like making the decision about moving to Gainesville from Austin, Texas, right? And like I used that to make a decision when I was moving from Oregon to Texas and so on and so forth, to just kind of get an idea of like how far my dollar goes. A lot of those calculations are going to be like personal calculations that you're going to need to make. But I will say the cost of living, without talking about like any other area, the cost of living in Gainesville is pretty nice. I'll just say for me, like my partner and I, we pay $1,295 for our 1,300 2-2 with a loft, and it's in like a gated apartment complex with indoor basketball court and tennis court, which is not what I was paying for not the same amount of apartment in Austin. So like that is something to definitely consider when you're thinking about where you want to be. That's part of the reason why I kind of mentioned going to law school in a college town, in my opinion, is kind of a good situation. Because I understand the draw of cities. I'm from the Atlanta area. Like I said, I lived in Austin. My partner lived in Houston. Like we obviously have our love for cities, but the cities are always going to be there. And it's likely that you're probably going to live in a metro area when you're practicing. Not guaranteed, but likely. So those are kind of always going to be there for you if that's something you're interested in. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but then regarding the gap year, I mentioned it because my main reason for taking a gap year was saving up some more money to use during my 1L year, just to have even just a little bit of padding. So I wanted to get your opinion on what other factors we should consider, or if you would recommend just diving straight into it, depending on what type of student you are.
Yeah, that's going to be a very much like a personal decision. Like what I will say is like we don't view gap years positively or negatively, right? Like, they just are kind of what they are. There are some advantages to a gap year, like you said, saving the money, getting some extra work experience to put on the resume. All of those could be good reasons for taking gap years. On the flip side, some students just want to plow on through and get through with their legal education and go ahead and get out and don't want to take that time off. And that's gonna, like I said, is gonna be a personal decision on whether or not that's the route you want to take. But we won't hold it against you, nor will like we benefit someone for taking it again.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The advice I usually give is if you have a reason for taking it, like, well, I'll have more time to prepare for the LSAT, I'll be able to apply earlier. Make sure you actually do that. So that's the, make that gap year count. If you're doing it to earn some money, make sure you're saving up money. Make that year count. And, I probably have advised as many students to take it a year as I've said not to, because it just depends on the person's situation. But that's definitely a talk to your professor, come talk to me, and we'll give you our advice. What other questions do you all have?
I have a question regarding like letters of recommendation. So do you guys have a preference whether or not it's a professional or like an academic preference, or I guess like a recommendation from like a professor, or like say you got a job at like a law office, like which one would hold more weight?
Sure, that's a really good question. So letters of recommendation. So one, we require one, we accept up to four. I usually tell students 2 to 3 is kind of the sweet spot. And so a couple things for your question. So if you're going straight through, or you're like within a year of graduating, we want at least one from a professor, right? We want at least one from someone who can like give us an idea of you as a student. Now, once you start getting more than a year out, we don't expect you to maintain those relationships in a way to get an effective letter of recommendation. If you have and you can get one, then that's awesome. But we don't expect them at that point. In terms of thinking about who you want to write your letter of recommendation, generally speaking, professors and supervisors are the best, but it's less about who they are and it's more about what they will say about you, right? So it's more important about more important to think about like, what is this person going to say about me than like, what is this person's title? How quote unquote like impressive are they going to find this person, right? Because like the vast majority of letters of recommendation are the same. The person sat in my class, they answered questions, they were intelligent, they got a good grade, right? But it's those letters of recommendation where the person clearly like knows you and is advocating for you, where they have like anecdotes about you to kind of like go with whatever assessment they have for you. They clearly have known your goals. So like I would really recommend getting to know your professors, going to office hours, having these conversations. One, just because you should, but two, because like it'll help you with the letter of recommendation. And kind of going through this, because those are going to be the ones that stand out to us. The ones that students tend to like, the most common one that we see where students probably think it has sway, but it doesn't have any, is this is some prominent attorney or politician that like I've never actually met, or like is a family friend, or knows my parents, or like I was friends with, their kid, and so they're writing it on my behalf, but they don't have any knowledge of your work product. They don't have any knowledge of the work you put in, or your work ethic, right? It's much more of like, I've known this person forever and they're a great person and they'd be good in law school because like I'm a lawyer. Those don't do anything in terms of like swaying us, right? But, if you volunteered for a local nonprofit or something, or did some charity work, and the person who just like oversaw your volunteering, and they can talk about how awesome of a person and selfless of a person you are and how hard you worked and the hours that you put in, like that, on the other hand, would, right? So like that would be kind of how I would approach these letters of recommendation when thinking about getting them. And in terms of like adding on like an additional letter of recommendation, if it's going to bring value above what the other 2 or 3 have already done, then add it, right? Go for that 4th one. But if that 4th one is just so you can have 4, it's not necessary. Like it won't hurt your application, but it's questionable whether it would add anything at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I'll just add, as somebody who writes a bunch of letters of recommendation, the office hours advice is really good advice, because my letters all follow a similar format. If I don't know anything beyond how we've interacted in class, just coming to talk to me once or twice, I can learn so much about you, and I will be able to write in my letter, they took the time to come see me and talk about law school, and any other interactions that we've had. That's what makes your letter more unique. So it's definitely, I know I was not the type to come up and talk to professors all the time, but I tell students to not be like me, because when I was looking for letters for graduate school, I had a hard time. Where were they going to write? He did well in class, but I don't really know who he is. You want to at least, even if you're not the type to talk up in class much, come to office hours. We're always happy to talk. And that's how we can get to know you as a person, not just a name on the list. I think we might have time for one more question, and then we should probably.
Yeah, sorry. It's
Go
about
ahead.
the LSAT. So I've heard from some people that it's like a one and done thing. Like once you take the LSAT, like it looks better for law schools if you take it once. But then I've heard other people where it's beneficial to them to like see the progress and then submit those scores to the law school. Like, how would you view that? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Sure. And one thing I do want to say is a lot of what I've said today is going to be generally applicable across law schools, but make sure you're asking these questions to all the law schools that you're interested in, because while a lot of things are really standardized like across law schools in terms of the admissions process, every law school kind of has like their own little tweak or like their own way of like looking at different things or what they're, kind of want to get from a student. So I do want to just encourage, like, take the information that I'm telling you as like general advice, but like definitely make sure, like, if you're interested in following up with FSU, talk to Ralph about this tomorrow, right? Like if you're interested in Miami, if you're interested in Emory, if you're interested in Stetson, like talk to Darren at Stetson. You know what I mean? Like have these conversations with folks at the individual law schools, because their answers may be a little bit different than mine. And so with that, LSAT, taking it. So back when I went to law school, it was a one and done type thing back then, right? Like it was not something where it was recommended to take it more than once. And if you took it more than once, they would average the score. That has changed significantly since I went to law school. And I am not that old, like I promised. But now I would say it is rarer to see someone take it once than seeing someone take it 2 or 3 times. I would not recommend taking it more than 3 times. Like once you start getting 4, 5, 6, 7 times, we're going to start wondering, like, is this person just learning, kind of gaming the test to some extent by taking it a bunch of times and like going up 1 or 2 points each time? And, we may not do a hard average, but we may kind of consider the range a little bit more. You take it 1 to 3 times, we're just taking the highest score. If one score is way higher or lower than the others, like that would be a time to write an addendum. Kind of what I mentioned earlier, but generally speaking, you take it 1 to 3 times, we're not going to bat an eye. We're going to take the highest score. And in fact, like, and I would judge like whether or not you want to take it more than once by where you're getting on your practice test, right? Like if you're doing your practice test at a score and you hit that score on the nose, that one time you took it, like, I mean, you can take it again if you want to, but you're probably hitting where you should hit on the LSAT, right? Like if you're getting practice test scores at one score and you come in like 8 points below it, yeah, you may want to consider like taking the LSAT again and trying to improve that score, right? And kind of using that as a gauge. But that's kind of how it works. But yeah, no, if you're taking it more than once, that's not an issue at all. But you start taking it a bunch of times, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, that could be a little bit more probable.
And I'll just add that is the same kind of advice we've been getting from others who've come in, that has changed. And so there's nothing wrong with taking it a second or third time. But yeah, if don't make a hobby out of it. I don't think anybody wants to take the LSAT 5 or 6 times really. So, all right, well, we should probably wrap things up because we are past 7 o'clock. If you have one-on-one questions, of course, like I said, I will share contact information with everybody who filled out the survey. And I don't know if you have any extra time to chat with anybody, but I want to thank Brandon Sykes for being here to share all of his insider information from UF so that we can be a little bit more prepared. when we do eventually apply to law school. So thank you for your time, and thank you to all the students here for taking the time out to